editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. He served as the director of the Institute of Historical Research in London and has published widely on Victorian political and social history. Among his books is an edited collection of essays entitled The Blind Victorian, Henry Fawcett and British Liberalism. Henry Fawcett married Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's sister, Millicent, having first proposed to Elizabeth. Professor Goldman lectured in the centenary celebrations for Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in her hometown of Aldborough, Suffolk, in 2018. The loos, for anybody who doesn't know, are just out and to the left, and the donation box is just over to the right. I think that's everything from me. I'll pass over to Lawrence. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Can you all hear me? That's the first thing. You can. Good. Excellent. Very good indeed. Thank you, Tom. You've stolen my best lines, in fact, and told the audience the one great research find of my own that I'll be talking about this evening. Anyway, for me, this is a great pleasure because it takes me back to work that I did as a postgraduate many years ago, actually in Cambridge, where I was a postgraduate and then a junior research fellow. And I was interested, as you'll discover, in an organisation called the Social Science Association, to which the Garrett sisters went. And I got interested in Henry Fawcett, who was a key member of the organisation. And as Tom has told you, he was very much involved with the Garrett family. And that's how I became interested in Elizabeth, Millicent, and the Garretts. But now I find myself living down the road from where they grew up in Aldborough in Suffolk. I'm a near neighbour in Suffolk. So there's another reason for interest in the family. And so today it's a bit like going home in all senses of that phrase. Let's begin with some pictures. Let's get an image of Elizabeth clear in our minds. And so here she is in her prime, lovely posed photo from the Victorian period. And that's our woman as a medical practitioner. Here she is as a young girl. Okay. And there she is in later life. And that portrait is in the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead. Okay. Let's go back. In 1840, in London, the first World Anti-Slavery Convention was held, and a woman rose to speak from the separate enclosure in which all the women attendees of the meeting had been corralled. There was consternation and uproar. She was silenced. The following day, the Times carried an editorial on the meeting and made very unkind remarks on the manners of our American cousins, because the woman in question was from the United States, and her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And there she is. And she's often compared with Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who is the equally famous sister of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, our subject this evening. What you're looking at is, in fact, the meeting where Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood up and tried to speak. It doesn't show where the women are corralled exactly. They might be on the balcony on the right-hand side. There seem to be some here, as it were, in the foreground, not quite where the action is taking place. But this is an image from 1840, from that meeting. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton went on to, let's go back and see her, she went on to lead the American women's movement in the search for the vote in 19th century America. And she often attested that it was her treatment here in London in 1840 which made her into the leading American feminist of her generation. In Britain in 1840, no respectable woman would speak in public. That was a privilege for men only. But if we fast forward beyond 1840, and there's Millicent, So we better have a look at her before we move on. But if we move on and look at this lady, Mary Carpenter, something rather remarkable happened 17 years later in 1857, because at the opening congress of an organization called the Social Science Association, this lady spoke openly in public in mixed company, and it goes down as the first time a respectable woman, spoke in public. Working class women, radical women, had spoken in the Chartist movement, but this was the first time. Now, her name was Mary Carpenter, and she spoke about her work rescuing street children in Bristol and educating them in what the Victorians called ragged schools. She was already a famous female philanthropist. The audience for her was so large at this landmark event that a woman should speak in public, that actually it couldn't take place. They all had to move to another bigger venue before she was able to give her speech. And from this start, the Social Science Association became the preeminent forum and venue for women to discuss feminist issues in public in mid-Victorian Britain. And among those who attended and spoke at its meetings were the two Garrett sisters, Elizabeth and Millicent. And that is the cover of the book I published about 25 years ago on the Social Science Association. And you can actually see lots of women sitting. This is an image of Edinburgh in 1863. The Edinburgh Congress. The first was 1857 in Birmingham. Now we're in Edinburgh in 1863, but you can see lots of women there attending and listening to Lord Brougham open the Congress. Now, it was during the 1850s that an organised feminist movement emerged in Britain, and the two Garrett sisters made contact with it in London. It was known as the Langham Place Circle, named after a location not very far from here, of course, just by Portland Place, just off Oxford Street. And it was through the Langham Place Circle that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson met Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was an English woman who'd trained as a physician in the United States and who returned to England to have her name entered on the new medical register, which had been established following the 1858 Medical Act, which in this country set up the modern medical profession. And that's Elizabeth Blackwell. I think in older age, but this is the lady who first practiced medicine in Britain, but she had trained in the United States. Again, another example of America being, in this matter, perhaps a generation ahead of us. So Blackwell became the first woman to legally practice medicine in Britain, and her influence and example encouraged Elizabeth Garrett Anderson to become the first woman doctor to train in Britain and then practice here. The crucial point about Elizabeth is that she actually trains here, and we'll come to the difficulty of her training in a moment. Now, we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. The point I want to emphasize at the beginning is that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was enabled to become a pioneer in medicine and in women's causes more generally because, as the story about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mary Carpenter will show you, at this point in the mid-19th century, opportunities for women were beginning to open up. Women were more visible and active in public. More women were becoming authors and writers for magazines and journals, and print culture, as historians like to call it, was expanding exponentially in the mid-19th century. In 1855, Mr. Gladstone removed the hated taxes on knowledge, the stamp that put the price of printed material way beyond the means of ordinary working class people. And you had an explosion of writing in journals and magazines, and women took part in it. New professional structures and organizations were established, and women were enabled in some cases to join them, in other cases not so. But it was a long and hard struggle, maybe, but those structures were there. Women campaigned to be eligible to sit the new Oxford and Cambridge local examinations that were introduced by the two universities in the late 1850s. The aim was to set and also raise standards in secondary schools, and these are in fact the ancestors of today's A-levels. I suspect standards may have been a little higher then, but still. Cambridge opened its examinations, its locals as they were called, to women candidates in 1865. 4 years later, in 1869, Gladstone's first government passed something called the Endowed Schools Act, often overlooked by the 1870 Education Act, but for women, in some ways more important, because the Endowed Schools Act allowed for the reform and redeployment of educational endowments across the country, and it allowed for girls' schools to be formed. Some of the very best girls' schools to this day were formed out of the 1869 Endowed Schools Act and the way you could remodel finances to construct new schools for girls. At the same time, there were passed in 1870 and 1882 Married Women's Property Acts, which allowed women for the first time to own property once they were married. Previously, unless a marriage settlement had been arranged in advance, what we might call a prenup, but only 1 in 10 women was availed of a marriage settlement in the mid-Victorian period. Well, unless that was in place, a woman's property automatically became her husband's on marriage. And as you know, it's a theme of dozens and dozens of Victorian novels. Trollope in particular is interested in that theme. But now, for the first time, married women who wrote for magazines and journals could keep the 10 or 20 guineas that they might receive for an article or a story in a Victorian magazine. It was their own. Now, in an age when the employment of middle-class women was an especial problem, there were several ventures to improve opportunities for them. Hitherto, of course, a woman who came from a good home but who did not marry or who had no means could become a governess. Perhaps she would emigrate, but there was little else. The Society for Promoting the Employment of Women, however, founded in 1858, tried to find other alternatives, and it came out of the Langham Place circle. Now, one of the alternatives at this stage was this: Emily Faithfull's Victoria Press. And there you can see Miss Faithfull with all her printers, her female printers, around her. The Victoria Press was established in 1858. It was staffed by women. She became printer and publisher in ordinary to Queen Victoria. She published, in fact, the Victoria magazine, which was very popular at the time. And indeed, she printed the voluminous transactions of the Social Science Association as well. Women were also active in the field of public health, but in an untrained and unprofessional manner. They were amateurs, as it were. This was, of course, a central concern of the Victorian era, though there were no cures for many of the diseases afflicting the Victorian poor at this stage. So the Ladies' National Association for the Diffusion of Sanitary Knowledge did what it could to disseminate good practice and good habits among working class women. The Manchester branch of that organisation has the distinction of introducing into Britain the practice of home visiting directly after a birth. So women who had an interest in medicine and caring and curing would be involved in these kinds of, in a sense, amateur, non-professional organisations. Louisa Twining's workhouse visiting society was actually more than a vehicle for traditional womanly assistance to the poor. It was founded again in the late 1850s, a very interesting crucible moment for the women's movement. It promoted the improvement of conditions under the poor law in workhouses. I must say, outside you have a lovely board with a kind of idyllic description of workhouses. Somebody perhaps might need to revisit that at some point. It sounds ideal, but it wasn't, I assure you, which is why Louisa Twining's Workhouse Visiting Society was required. 10 years later, in 1869, women would help to found the Charity Organisation Society here in London, a pioneer of casework with individual families in need of help and support, one of the originators of modern social work in this country, indeed in all countries. The Charity Organisation Society spread its model literally around the world. So it's into this picture of a changing world for women, not changing fast, but nevertheless beginning to open up, that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson emerges at the end of the 1850s. She was just the right age to benefit from these early feminist reforms and to build on them through her own initiatives and her social pioneering as well. She was born, in fact, on the 9th of June, 1836. And the address where she was born gives it away, or at least it seems rather odd. Number 1, Commercial Road in Whitechapel, which is not at all a smart district in the 1830s. Her father, Newson Garrett, was in fact, at that point, running a pawnbroker's shop for his father-in-law. It wasn't really what he was cut out for, and it wasn't really what a man of his station and his wealth would do for the rest of his life. Far from it. In fact, they moved when Elizabeth was 3 years old to a larger pawnbroker's shop in Long Acre in Covent Garden. But this was literally only minding the shop for a little while because Suffolk reclaimed Newson Garrett. The Garrett family had been residents in eastern Suffolk since the early 17th century. They had roots there. Newson Garrett was actually born in Leiston in Suffolk. And if you know your Suffolk coast, that's the site of the Sizewell nuclear power station, which dominates the skyline in all directions. In 1841, Newson and his wife Louisa and their children moved back to Snape, close to Aldborough. It was there that Newson had bought a barley and coal merchant's business. And over time, he constructed Snape maltings. It's a range of buildings for the malting of barley. And the malted barley was transshipped onto sailing barges, which went down the River Ald, out into the North Sea, round, and then up the Thames, where all the breweries were, and where the malted barley was used in the brewing of beer. And this is a picture of the workforce at Snape Maltings, when it was a Maltings. At least I hope it's a picture of the workforce. I can't quite tell, but there are some smart ladies and some men in rough clothes. So I think it's probably the whole workforce. And many, I'm sure, will know this today. We're in the next week, I think, is the annual Aldborough Festival. And you'll know, of course, that in the 1950s, Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears reclaimed the derelict buildings and turned it into the venue of the annual Aldborough Music Festival. And they're still working on it to this day. And it's been faithfully restored in ways that I think actually conserve the Victorian heritage for the good of us all, and certainly for the good of the music festival. And that's a view of it from the marshes. That's the main concert hall, which is in fact, of course, the main hall where the malt was left to germinate in the heat. Now, the family lived in Aldborough by the sea. In the 1850s, Elizabeth attended a girls' boarding school in Blackheath, run by the step-aunts of Robert Browning, and I've discovered some. Dad, in other words, was a liberal in his politics, and he was liberal in his attitudes as well. He encouraged his daughters in the same way that he encouraged his sons. And the fact that the Garrett family produced two pioneering feminists, not just Elizabeth, but Millicent as well, owed a great deal, of course, to the domestic atmosphere of that family. The Garrett children were free spirits, encouraged by their parents to hold strong opinions and to develop grand ambitions. Elizabeth, whether she was taught by a governess at home, as she was when she was young, or at the school in Blackheath, was a decided teenage rebel. Everybody said so. And you have to be, I think, given what was to come. Now, at age 18, at the home of some school friends, she was very fortunate to meet this woman, Emily Davis, younger then, at the end of the beginning of the 1860s. And Emily Davis may be known to you because she's the pioneer of women's higher education. She's the founder of Girton College in Cambridge, the first of the women's colleges in either Oxford or Cambridge. She founded that in 1869, originally in Hitchin, but it moved to Girton outside Cambridge in 1869. And it was through Emily Davis that Elizabeth entered the Langham Place Circle and took her position in this first organised feminist movement in British history. The Langham women were responsible for the publication of the first female periodical in Britain, or feminist periodical, the English Women's Journal. And they also founded, as I mentioned, the Society for Promoting the Employment of Women. And it was this society that organised Elizabeth Blackwell's lectures on medicine as a profession for ladies, which Elizabeth attended and which allowed her to meet Blackwell in person. And with her support, with Blackwell's support, Elizabeth Garrett, at the end of the 1850s, decided that she would pursue a medical career, not for her workhouse visiting, not for her the Ladies' Sanitary Association, if you like, amateur good works. She wanted to train and practice as a doctor. Now, as fathers often are, Newson Garrett was initially against her plans, but he came round and he gave her his full support, both moral and financial, and the finance was required. And so began Elizabeth's long struggle to achieve a medical training and become a female doctor at a time when neither universities nor medical schools were open to women. So, in a sense, how did she do it? This is a complex story, as you'll see. She applied initially to many different medical schools, but they all rejected her. When in 1860 she met in person with the registrar of the University of London to try to win a place as a medical student there, he described her as a bumptious, self-asserting girl. The later assessment of the British Medical Journal was rather different. She had displayed indomitable perseverance and pluck, and the Victorians liked pluck, I think. So, what did she do next? She spent 6 months as a surgery nurse at the Middlesex Hospital here in London and attended lectures that were provided there for the male doctors in the apothecary, which we would call the pharmacy. She was unsuccessful in her attempt to enroll in the Middlesex's medical school, and she employed a private tutor to teach her anatomy and physiology because she couldn't get in anywhere. And then she managed to get into the dissecting room and the chemistry lectures. She sort of wormed her way in. However, there were complaints from the male students about her admittance. They didn't want a woman among them, so she was obliged to leave the Middlesex Hospital, though she did have certificates in chemistry and materia medica, which we would call pharmacology today. She'd also somehow got certificates in anatomy and physiology. She was building up competence, she was getting lower qualifications, but she wasn't on any pathway into a medical school and into the profession at this stage. So that route closed, thrown out of the Middlesex, effectively. She tried another one via the Society of Apothecaries, whose examinations also led to medical registration, though it was the least prestigious way of becoming a physician in Victorian Britain. And she was tutored privately for the apothecaries examinations, which didn't specifically disbar women. It just referred to the candidate will study, the candidate will sit this exam. She took a room in Whitechapel in order to study nursing at the London Hospital and clinical practice at the London Dispensary, which was a very overstretched clinic for poor people in Spitalfields in the east of London. Now, threatened with legal action by her father, good old Newson, if they attempted to exclude her, the apothecaries allowed her to take their exams, which she passed. And in 1865, she obtained the license of the Society of Apothecaries, and her name was thus entered onto the medical register, which had been established in 1858 in that way. And she was the first woman to achieve this in Britain. And as you may know, the apothecaries still exist. There's Apothecaries Hall. But what the apothecaries really are a medieval guild, a society, rather than, a proper way of learning medicine, either then or now. The letters LSA were really a low status qualification. So in 1870, Elizabeth took further examinations, but this time they were from the Sorbonne in Paris, and she obtained the degree of MD from there. She was, in fact, the first woman to graduate MD in France. And of course, to take her examinations in Paris, her French had to be rather good because she had to take the examinations in French. So we're getting a sense of her intellectual level, I think. In 1874, she was refused, and she was already practicing medicine, as I'll explain in a moment. She was refused membership of the Obstetrical Society here in London, in Britain. In the previous year, 1873, she had been allowed to join the British Medical Association, which had been set up in 1832. But 5 years later, so that's 1878, the BMA voted against the admission of any more women. And so for 19 years, until 1892, she was the only woman member of the British Medical Association, the major professional organisation of doctors. So she blazed a trail, but the medical profession was very slow to open up after her. Indeed, in several cases in this story, as you can see, she crept through a door which they locked and bolted after she had got in case any other woman would follow her example. But interestingly, I suppose she had the last laugh. It's a measure of her success that in 1897, she was elected president of the East Anglian regional branch of the BMA. So they saw the error of their ways eventually. Clearly, she was exceptional. She was motivated. She was individualistic. She had pluck. Hard though she tried, however, she found it very difficult to build on her success and bring more women into the profession after her. But of course, that wasn't her fault. It must be put down to the conservatism and the prejudice of the male medical profession at that time. So that's how she got to be a doctor. But where and how did she practice medicine? That's another set of problems for this pioneer physician. And it's also a complex story of several different employments and several different ventures. Unlike men of her intellectual caliber, she couldn't secure stable and high status medical employment at first. So although she had a valid medical qualification, as a woman, no hospital would actually employ her. As I'll say in a moment, she had an honorary association with one, but she couldn't make any money out of it. So she set up in private practice at 20 Upper Berkeley Street, London, which, if you know your London geography, as I'm sure you do, is a pretty smart address. It was then, and it still is now. And that's the blue plaque, which you can see there. The first woman to qualify as a doctor in Britain lived here. But then, with the support of some very prominent patrons, she established the St Mary's Dispensary for women and children at 69 Seymour Place, Marylebone. And there it is. Not a very grand, it's the corner building as you look at it. And that's her dispensary. And it was focused, of course, on the needs of ordinary women in a crowded and deprived area of London. And it was a great success from the first. Women paid a penny for a consultation. Even that was beyond the means of some, so Elizabeth set up a fund that would pay for the costs of women who couldn't pay their own way. In its first year, she saw approximately 3,000 female patients. One of the early patients, 1874, was Eleanor Marx, the 19-year-old daughter of Karl Marx, who, of course, lived in London from 1848 until his death in 1883. She apparently was suffering from nervous exhaustion, and Elizabeth prescribed a very sensible new regime: regular meals, plenty of exercise, purposeful occupation, and fewer cigarettes as well. So in 1871, she opened 10 beds above this dispensary, so the patients lived above the shop, as we might put it, and she called it the New Hospital for Women and Children. The staff were all women, making it the first such hospital for women, staffed by women in Britain. And those appointed initially obtained their medical qualifications abroad, and they were unregistered, so they were not actually on the medical register. They weren't truly doctors, as was understood at the time. And of course, the new hospital, as you might expect, specialized in the treatment of gynecological conditions. Now, it moved the new hospital to a larger site in Marylebone Street in 1874. And I'm told that this is it in 1874. You can see the thing, the New Hospital for Women. This is the nice building that it was in from 1874 onwards. I'm told it's now the site of the Landmark Hotel. And you are, natives, and you may know this hotel. It's not one I frequent, I must admit, above my pay grade, I suspect. In 1890, the hospital moved again to a still larger site on the Euston Road, and there it is. It's very close to the British Library. I often pass it. I'm sure you recognise it. It's actually the headquarters or offices of Unite, the trade union. Yeah.
I was a patient there.
Yes, I'm about to come to it, my dear. Absolutely. And it remained. I mean, she raised £21,000 to get it, and it continued the tradition of treating women patients by women doctors into the early 1980s. And I remember, because I'm a Londoner, I grew up here, that it was threatened with closure and amalgamation, and the female staff occupied the building. That's right. And there was a long occupation and banners outside it, I recall, in the late 1970s. We're not giving your age away, I hope. No.
I don't mind that at all. I'm 83.
Oh, well, there you are. But anyway, they wanted, obviously, a specifically women's hospital staffed by women to be retained, though in the end they were unsuccessful. And indeed, apparently there is still, I've never seen it, but there is a gallery in there devoted.
There is.
There is. Thank you. And you can go and see more about her life. And I think one day I better go and have a look, actually. In 1870, as I mentioned, she'd also been given an honorary appointment at the East London Hospital for Children. She wasn't paid, therefore, but it was the first hospital appointment ever given to a woman in Britain. She wasn't paid, and she didn't actually stay there long because obviously she was doing all these other things as well for women's health. But that was another first in her career. Although most of her work was associated with the care of poorer women, she also built up a private practice as well, serving wealthier women, but she very rarely saw male patients. She worked almost exclusively with women. Now, alongside all of these professional achievements, she was also quite literally a politician, a wife, and a mother. And all of those things are, in a way, part of the pioneering we're talking about. In 1864, she had turned down a proposal of marriage from Henry Fawcett. No. Henry, I am Henry's biographer. And Henry was blind. He was blinded by his father on a shoot. His father, he grew up in Salisbury. His father was a draper and shopkeeper. They had gone shooting pheasants. Henry was in front of the shooting party. His father's sight was poor. He didn't see his son. He blasted away. Pellets entered Henry's eyes. Now, this, we shouldn't smile. This man was a remarkable figure. He is, as far as we know, the first man to be elected to Parliament, to the House of Commons, who was already blind. Many went blind, but he was already blind. It was said that in his life, he was the second most popular Victorian to Queen Victoria herself. When he died in 1884, in that last week of his life, he was cared for by Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and Victoria sent daily requests for information. He was enormously celebrated, and we should not smile. He wasn't perhaps much to look at. He was Professor of Economics at Cambridge. He was MP for Brighton from 1865. He was a great man, not one of the famous Victorians, but nevertheless an indomitable figure. Elizabeth turned him down largely because she still hadn't qualified. It was 1864, and she was still fighting, as it were, the medical establishment to get her qualifications. Henry didn't give up, turned his affections towards Millicent Garrett, Elizabeth's younger sister, whom he married in the next year. It's a wonderful story. The news of Abraham Lincoln's death reached London about 3 weeks after John Wilkes Booth had shot Lincoln in Washington. That was in the middle of April, and it was early May, and both Henry and Millicent were at a party in Camden Hill, West London, the home of a radical MP called Peter Taylor. And Henry fell in love, it is said, with the sound of Millicent's voice as the whole company talked about the tragic death of their hero who had freed the slaves, Abraham Lincoln. He proposed to Millicent, and they married, and she took his name, so she became Millicent Garrett Fawcett. And she, of course, went on to lead the suffragist campaign. She lived to see all women over 21 enfranchised just before she died in 1929. And her statue, decades too late, was unveiled in Parliament Square in 2018 on the centenary of the Fourth Reform Act of 1918, which enfranchised all women over the age of 30 at that point. She is still the only woman in Parliament Square. Everyone else is a man. We need to do something about that, I think. Now, like her sister, Elizabeth was an a suffragist. And early in her life, she was active in the cause. Let me just stop and just show you. This is the book that I published in 1989, years and years ago. The Blind Victorian, Henry Fawcett and British Liberalism. It's a set of essays from a conference held at his Cambridge College, Trinity Hall. And the portrait is very celebrated. It's by Ford Madox Brown, the pre-Raphaelite. And you can see Millicent with her arm round Henry. And that's in the National Portrait Gallery, if you want to go and see it. Well, Elizabeth was also a suffragist. We can leave him there, that's okay. She was also a suffragist. She had been one of the sponsors in 1865, 1866 of the first petition calling on Parliament to grant women the vote. The petition was rejected, but it was supported by many notable Liberal politicians and intellectuals, most notably John Stuart Mill, who'd just become an MP himself in 1865. And in the following year, 1866, she joined the Women's Suffrage Committee. And she remained very involved, but somewhat on the sidelines, if you see what I mean, in the cause of women's suffrage. She was a founder member of the National Women's Suffrage Society, which her sister led and which was the key organisation in the struggle for the vote for women. But she was doing other things, because in 1870, Elizabeth stood for election to the newly created London School Board following Gladstone's famous 1870 Elementary Education Act. This concerned younger children, not secondary children, from the Endowed Schools Act the year before. And she was a candidate for the Marylebone district. Women were eligible for election to this new body, which is another sign of the change in the status of women. And actually, she was already very famous and already very celebrated in 1870, and she got the highest number of votes of any candidate standing for the London School Board across London. Now, her campaign had been masterminded by this man, a feminist man, and the movement depended on men like this. He was a partner in his family's shipping firm, the Orient Steamship Line. And James Anderson, well, it was no surprise that the candidate married her election agent 3 months after the election to the London School Board. They had one son, Alan, and 2 daughters, and sadly one of the daughters died of meningitis, but the other, Louisa, became a doctor herself. And Elizabeth broke all sorts of conventions, again, because she continued her career after marriage whilst raising a family. And of course, many women will know, whether they're professional or not, that women, until really quite recently, were supposed to give up their profession on marrying and having children. That was certainly true in academic life until the 1960s. So Elizabeth recognized her responsibility to other women wanting a medical career. And several became her apprentices, among them Edith Peachey, the first woman to practice medicine outside London. It was a very London-based organisation, based upon the feminist organisations here in the capital. But she opened a surgery in Leeds in 1877. And Frances Hogan, who was the first woman doctor to be registered in Wales. And these were, if you like, her protégés, those who followed in her wake, who she educated and supported. But the route to professional practice that Elizabeth had taken via the Society of Apothecaries was closed, another example of the problem, closed to women in 1868, when the apothecaries decided to admit to their exams only male students from recognised medical schools. Quite simply, they replaced the word person with the word man in all the governing documents, making it impossible for another woman to exploit, as Elizabeth had done, this loophole. So years of professional struggle followed as Elizabeth and others tried to batter down the doors of medical schools across Britain. Now, some went abroad to be trained properly and to gain a medical qualification abroad. The universities of Zurich and Bern in Switzerland were notable destinations for these early feminist women doctors. Others, like Sophia Jex-Blake, there she is, initially based in Edinburgh, led public campaigns in Britain for medical training for women here. Now, Elizabeth favoured the first strategy, go abroad, but not the second, get yourself somehow into British medical schools. She hoped that the development of a cadre of women with foreign medical qualifications who were seen to be practicing medicine successfully in Britain would persuade all the authorities to open medical schools to women students. By example, and this was a very well-tried tactic in the women's movement, by example, women would show that they were the equals of men, and it would be possible for them, therefore, to change institutional practices. Elizabeth disliked Sophia Jex-Blake's much more public and confrontational approach, which actually was defeated in the Scottish courts in 1873. Jex-Blake and 6 other women had been admitted to the Edinburgh University Medical School. However, under the Edinburgh University statutes, they were not allowed to graduate. So Jex-Blake took the university to court. She sued. She lost the case. Elizabeth's view was that it was needlessly confrontational. That wasn't the approach that she favoured. Elizabeth also disagreed with Jex-Blake's attempt to establish a separate medical qualification for women, a separate one. She argued that it would always be seen as inferior to the male qualification, better to qualify abroad, equally, as it were, with men abroad and return to practice in Britain, than to be seen to have a different qualification, which by implication could be dismissed as an inferior qualification. Nevertheless, when Jex-Blake came south to London and opened the London School of Medicine for women in 1874, Elizabeth gave it her support. She joined the school's governing council, also its teaching staff, and she provided the students of the school with clinical experience at her new hospital for women. So although they had differences, they did cooperate. Now, as this suggests, like any great social movement faced by injustice and historic wrongs, there were differences over tactics and approach within the mid-Victorian women's movement. It wasn't straightforward. Much later, of course, in the early 20th century, Millicent Garrett Fawcett, as a suffragist, had to deal with the Pankhurst family as suffragettes. And of course, the suffragettes used violence and various forms of unlawfulness in order to make the case for votes for women, which Millicent and those around her, the long-serving suffragists who trudged through this campaign since the 1860s, they thought, and historians tend to agree with them, they thought was needlessly inflammatory and actually caused a strong reaction against women. It was better to persuade by democratic and constitutional means. Now, to give further examples of these strategic differences, because it's important for another of Elizabeth's interests, Mary Carpenter, we go back to Mary, who spoke in public for the first time in 1857. She believed, an example of a different strategy, that women should avoid political subjects altogether, play no role in politics at all, but seek to widen women's sphere by good works alone. Emily Davis, we've seen Emily, the founder of Girton College, she was actually a conservative in her politics. She only favoured the vote for single women and widows. If you were married, your husband would speak for you at the ballot box and he would vote for you. And she genuinely believed in this. And she argued with the feminist movement over pursuing votes for women. She thought it would hamper the cause to which she was devoted, which was the higher education of women. Now, as for Elizabeth, she found herself in opposition to most women and feminists over a particularly controversial set of laws and medical practices in the period of the 1860s and 1870s, known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. It's interesting and important that we see Elizabeth in all different perspectives. Now, the Contagious Diseases Acts, there were three of them, were passed by Parliament in 1864, 66, and 69. They were passed to try to control the spread of venereal diseases, VD, in the Army and the Navy, which were at epidemic levels. They were introduced at first to regulate behaviour in designated naval ports and barracks, but they were successively extended geographically to take in almost all military facilities in Britain. And some zealots would have extended them to take in the whole nation, not only the military, but civilians as well. And what they allowed the police and military authorities to do was to apprehend suspected prostitutes, subject them to forcible internal examination, and if found to be diseased, detain them in so-called lock hospitals. They were literally locked in for 3 months, where regular doses of mercury, which is of course a poison, would be administered as a cure. Now, at the end of the 1860s, a movement emerged to secure the repeal of these acts, and it was led by another of the great pioneering feminists of the era, Josephine Butler. Now, to many women and to many feminist men also, these laws were unconscionable because they accepted the fact of prostitution, and they said, well, you know, we'll have to accept it. We'll just regulate it better and we'll make it less of a problem. We'll make prostitution disease-free, as it were. In a sense, what the acts were doing were blaming women for the diseases carried also by men. They, of course, would suffer no punishment for their part in the sexual act. And there were soon stories, some perhaps apocryphal, of perfectly respectable Victorian women and their daughters being pulled off the streets and subjected to internal examination. This was unequal legislation. It was stigmatizing women and not men. Radical feminists, but also highly conservative churchmen, men of the cloth, could unite, and they did unite, for the repeal of these heinous measures in one of the great extra-parliamentary agitations of the Victorian period. And they were successful, because in 1886, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. And it's another remarkable feminist triumph. But one notable group defended the acts throughout: the medical profession. Only too well aware of the awful effects of venereal diseases and the inefficacy of Victorian treatments of them, of course, most doctors defended the acts and the infringements of liberty that they allowed, of course, as necessary for the public's health and the public's good. So libertarian arguments that the state had no business infringing the rights of citizens in this manner, deploying, you might say, a kind of medical police force, were answered by utilitarian arguments from the medical profession that the greatest happiness of the greatest number required this kind of draconian intervention. And in this dispute, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson split from her feminist friends and colleagues because she supported the acts. And she published a short study in favour of them in 1870, entitled An Inquiry into the Character of the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1866 to 1869. At the Social Science Association in 1870, she found herself in debate with another notable reformer of the era, a man called Frederick Hill. And he was a staunch staunch opponent of the measures. So Elizabeth contended, I quote, that it was strictly a professional question upon which the opinion of the trustworthy medical witnesses ought to be accepted as final. Let the doctors decide. Hill responded that it required other knowledge than that of medicine to appreciate the issues involved. He went on, it would be as reasonable to leave it to farmers to say whether or not it was necessary to have corn laws, which was a reference back to the controversial Corn Laws of 1815, which protected the home market for British landholders and farmers, but which were repealed in the movement for free trade in 1846. It's like marking your own homework. That's what he's essentially saying. So we should note that if middle-class British women were united in their campaigns to remove obstacles to their collective advance, they were often divided over strategy, and particularly over specific issues. We shouldn't run away with the idea, as it were, that it was all a straightforward, onward march of women together. There were lots of debates and lots of disagreements, and you can understand why. Great social changes take decades to achieve, and they have to move forward on a very broad front. Differences of opinion are inevitable, as between Jex Blake and Elizabeth, as between Elizabeth and the feminists of Langham Place over the Contagious Diseases Acts. Elizabeth tended to take the side of professionalism over feminism when there was a clash between the two. But mostly there wasn't a clash, but occasionally there was. Well, to finish the story, in 1883, Elizabeth was appointed Dean of the London School of Medicine. She held that post for 2 decades from then on, and for the first time, really, in the 1880s and 1890s, she had stability and routine in her professional life. The school expanded in this period, and it became linked to the Royal Free Hospital, which was then located in Gray's Inn Road. As late as the 1980s, by which time the Royal Free had moved to Hampstead, near where I grew up, the Royal Free was thought of as a hospital for women, and women mainly trained there right into our own lifetime and our period of memory. Elizabeth was not, of course, and this I think must be clear from all I've said, really a notable academic doctor, and that wasn't her thing. Her energies went into what we would call professional development and institution building, but she wrote occasional articles for the British Medical Journal on specific cases of interest to the wider medical profession. And she did publish a short medical textbook in 1878, The Student's Pocket Index. But her most celebrated contribution to medical discussion was her answer to a very well-known Victorian doctor, Henry Maudsley, after whom the hospital, of course, is named, who in an article entitled Sex and Mind in Education argued that education in women caused overexertion, which reduced women's reproductive capacity and led to emotional disorders. Garrett responded in her published response, that it wasn't education that posed a threat to women, but inactivity and boredom. And she prescribed fresh air, exercise, and a sense of purpose, which I like because our family doctor was always telling my mother, plenty of fresh air, Mrs. Goldman, plenty of fresh air. Well, Elizabeth retired in 1902, and she was made president of the Royal Free Hospital, the School of Medicine. And like the best of us, as I've said, she went to live in Suffolk again. She returned to the family home to Aldborough. And there she chalked up yet another first in her life. She became the first elected lady mayoress in England, serving as mayoress in between 1908 and 1910. And you can see her there in her robes and chain, being led by what looks like the court jester, but anyway, through the streets of Aldborough. Her father, Newson, had been mayor in 1889, so there was a kind of family connection. She took an interest, as you would expect, in local housing and sanitation. And she died in the town in December of 1917, and she's buried in the churchyard there. And as Tom rightly said, I took part in a centenary of her life celebration in that year, 2017, 100 years later. And this is her as a little old lady, really, charming. Well, greatness comes in many shapes and sizes, and it depends on many different factors. What I hope I've shown you this evening is that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was certainly a natural and tenacious pioneer based on many talents that she had as a doctor, an organizer, an administrator, a campaigner. But I think I've also shown you, at least I've tried to show you, that greatness relies on the help of others as well. She came from a notably free, encouraging and liberal family where the daughters were treated equally with the sons. And she was very lucky in the friends that she made. Not every young woman in the late 1850s was befriended by Emily Davis or came literally into the circle of Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. She depended on that network of women in Langham Place. For many years afterwards, they gave her advice and support. She met and won the support of feminist men as well, who gave not only their time, but also their money to support her ventures. And among them was Henry Fawcett, who would have married her, and James Anderson, who did marry her. In my view, therefore, she succeeded not only because of her talents, but also because she was part of a wider feminist movement seeking women's advancement in many different spheres. And so I'll leave you with this rather nice postcard, the Jubilee Appeal for the new Hospital for Women, London. And what I like about it is that sense that the pioneers are all together. These are three women. This is a movement. This is not just Elizabeth. She's in the middle, but Sophia Jex-Blake is on the right and Elizabeth Blackwell on the left. There's an apocryphal story that on an evening in 1860, when Elizabeth was 24 years old, at the family home in Aldborough, she and Emily Davis selected their careers for the advancement of women in Britain. Elizabeth would open up the medical profession. Emily would open up higher education for them. And young Millicent, who was then only 13, was given the Herculean task of winning votes for women. And the remarkable thing is that all three of them succeeded. Thank you. Right, well, Tom, questions?
Yes, questions. Who would like to ask a question first? Right, I'll come over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have to confess that I am a woman doctor. And I am very proud of that history. My question really is rather a modern one, and to ask whether Elizabeth or any of her colleagues took an interest in obstetrics or contraception or the fertility aspects of women's lives.
Well, obstetrics, yes, and without question. But I think they would have said something like this. If we, I think we would put it this way. No one who was respectable could speak about contraception really until after the First World War, until Marie Stopes in the 1920s. I don't know what her views were on contraception. She was one of 11, although she herself had only 3 children. But that was quite normal in the late Victorian period, because that's the moment of demographic transition to notably smaller middle-class families. From the 1870s and 80s onwards, you cease to get those huge Victorian families, and they start to have, much fewer children. Now,
And presumably she married relatively late.
yes, absolutely. She married, 1871. So she was, what does that make her? 34, 35? Yes. So that's yes. So she was late, and she would have had her children very late for a Victorian woman. More and more you look at her and you think that she's a very modern figure. But imagine if, I don't know what her views were. I don't think anybody knows what her views were. Perhaps they never even thought of something as controversial as contraception. But imagine if they did and they had actually begun to talk about it. That would have almost certainly put the kibosh on women's medical advance, because they would have become associated with a radical and a heinous cause. And in a sense, your question is very interesting, but it takes 2 more generations before it can be openly discussed, as a valid way of women organising their own lives and bodies. So, yes, one would wonder. I'm not an expert on women's medical history. It's not really my area. In consequence, you might have to ask an expert, but you don't hear them discuss it. Yeah.
And obstetrics, were they?
Oh, well, they were very, I think that's, obs and gynae was what they were doing, as far as I understand it. That was very, she tried to join the obstetrical society and they wouldn't have her. And I think that's really the evidence. She was totally focused really on women's medicine, and therefore totally focused on precisely those subjects and issues. So they were very concerned about childbearing, how to look after pregnant women, how to care for the mother as well as the baby after birth, and so forth. So that was very central to their concerns. But contraception, I would think not. Yeah.
Thank you. Sue Brown, I might just mention, I've written about a lady called Julia Wedgwood, who helped Elizabeth Garrett in her 1870 Liberal election campaign, and said what a terrifically energetic organiser she was, and how she managed all that alongside with the medical. What I really wanted to ask about was, could you say a bit more about her relationship with her sister, Millicent?
Yes.
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 Did they fall out?
No, I don't think so. I have no evidence that they did. There seems to have been no difficulty between them, but as I say, I'm not. I haven't got so granular with them as to know everything. But there's no hint that, for example, the fact that Elizabeth had been proposed to by Fawcett, and then her younger sister had married Henry, there seems to be no difficulty in the family over that. And it's not uncommon in Victorian families for that sort of thing to go on. I suspect there were pretty intense debates around the dinner table, both when they were young and subsequently when they were married, about how best to take forward the different causes. But Elizabeth was always part of the suffragist movement. She was always on the committees that her sister chaired. She was always a sort of patron of the National Association of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was the organisation that really got women the vote. But, as we've said, she was so busy doing other things. And, there is this touching involvement in her brother-in-law's death, he fell ill. He was always of a weak constitution, and over the course of a week he died. But Elizabeth was there at his bedside, and she was helping. So there's no hint of a kind of a family discord. I think they got on well, but I suspect they were feisty and fiery and had plenty of arguments of a good-natured kind about where to go next in the women's movement.
Any more questions? Right, well, I just want to say a huge thank you to Lawrence. I've certainly enjoyed it a huge amount, and it seems like everybody has. And yeah, the next lecture in our lecture series is on the 4th of October, and it's focused on Sheikh Mohammed. So yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you, Lawrence.